some water.
No, oh, fine, thank you. Good morning and welcome to this side event on enhancing coordination between UNTOC and UNCAC, the why and the how. It is a side event that is jointly being organized by the European Public Law Organization, Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and Transparency International. The topic or the challenge is not really new, though this discussion about this might be relatively new, despite the fact that the same three organizations have in the past held similar side events and made statements at COSPs, at Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Commission, and other fora on the need for more coordination between the two mega anti-crime conventions, UNTOC and UNCAC. And indeed, partially it is for substantive reasons, which are very important, and that is that it is well recognized that corruption and organized crime are linked in a variety of ways, under a variety of circumstances. It is also being recognized more and more today that organized crime is much present in the legal economy, and that much of its presence in legal economy is via corruption. But there are also certain, if you like, technical issues or similarities that put these two mega conventions really close to each other. And if you look at any of the chapters on this convention, there are great similarities, starting from the prevention, which is much more developed in UNCAC rather than in UNTOC, but a number of provisions regarding prevention against corruption may as well apply to organized crime prevention. Or let's take another example, criminalization. We have at least 3 criminal offenses that are shared on a normative level. Corruption itself is a mandatory offense of UNTOC. And then we have obstruction of justice, which are both in UNTOC and UNCAC, not to mention money laundering, which also exists in both conventions with very similar provisions. Even further, if we talk about international cooperation, practically if you look at the institutes of international cooperation, mutual legal assistance, transfer of proceedings, transfer of sentenced persons, etc., they are exactly the same. And in addition, UNCAC has asset recovery, which I really never understood why it is not also in UNTOC, and because confiscation is in both. And so these are very similar things. Special investigative techniques are shared among these two anti-crime conventions. And obviously there are some other things that we will be dealing with that are similar in particular. And then, of course, when we come to the review mechanism, we will see that the structure, architecture of review mechanism is very similar, except that one for UNTOC is much more complicated because of the protocols, and its duration is extremely high. I must say that I don't find it very effective because of its duration. Things are changing very fast. But so even in the review mechanism, there are these big differences. And maybe the UNCAC review mechanism had a little bit more better position for civil society than the UNTOC review mechanism, including the role of the peer review and how it is organized. One at UNCAC that it allows for field visits, and one in UNTOC, which is actually, not that it's not allowing, but it's on a voluntary basis whether there should be a field visit in the peer review. So all in all, there are many things, but we also note that these two conventions don't talk to each other at all. Conferences of state parties, or COP and COSP, are held in different years. There is no interaction between two. There is an attempt at the level of the Commission somehow to bring them together, but that is not sufficient. So even from the governance level of the two conventions, they are divorced. And that is very bad. Today, when we are really challenged with global crime threats, we must have much more harmonized global crime responses. And the first thing to do is to harmonize more on a normative level, on a practical level, and in the governance level, UNTOC and UNCAC. Not to mention the need also to do much more coordination with the human rights instruments and decisions that were made there, migration-related issues, IOM, ILO, all these other agencies that are dealing with intellectual property, WIPO, etc., etc. So UN system is fragmented, but I must say that even the UN criminal justice system, now talking about these two conventions, is rather fragmented. So our appeal is to bring them more together, to make them more cohesive, more harmonious, and therefore more effective in terms of anti-crime, global anti-crime governance. So these were my introductory remarks. And now I have a great pleasure to give floor to Gillian Dell. She is the head of conventions, Transparency International, and for, as I already mentioned, some time involved in this attempt to provide better coordination between these two conventions. Gillian, good morning. We are sorry that you are not here with us, but it's nice to see you online. The floor is yours. Or the camera.
Thank you. Thank you, Ugi, and good morning to all. Greetings from Berlin. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person at the conference. Before turning to the subject of the panel, I'd like to say that we welcomed the historic vote on Monday in favor of the participation of 3 civil society groups in this conference. They had been at risk of exclusion due to state party objections, and we thought it was a very good decision that was made to include them. Now, turning to our subject, enhanced cooperation between UNCAC and UNTOC is something, as Ugi has mentioned, that we have proposed and discussed in a joint Transparency International GI-TOC written submission to the UNCAC Conference of States Parties last year, which we'd be happy to provide you with if you have any trouble finding it, as well as in a side event at that conference. And that submission and the event included a discussion of the concept of transnational organized corruption, which is something that we think should be taken seriously. Also, at the last session of the Crime Commission, Transparency International suggested that the Commission play a role in helping to enhance coordination between the two conventions, as well as with human rights and SDG bodies. The idea behind the suggested coordination between UNTOC and UNCAC is, as Ugi has suggested, that could contribute to effectiveness and efficiency in tackling both corruption and organized crime. I'll touch briefly first on the linkages between the two, and then a couple of proposals. Now, as Ugi already mentioned, the interlinkages are plain in the UNTOC with its articles 8 and 9 and on criminalization and prevention of corruption. And this is unsurprising since, as UNODC puts it, organized criminal groups use all forms of corruption to infiltrate political, economic, and social levels all over the world. So corruption prevention and investigations in all sectors are part of tackling organized crime. In our joint submission with GI-TOC to the UNCAC COSP, we provided two examples of how the more quote unquote traditional forms of organized crime, the Ndrangheta kind, penetrates law enforcement or the state more broadly, often using corruption. This may go as far as capture of the state by organized crime, the so-called mafia state. And we're talking here about structured groups engaged in illicit activities like trafficking, smuggling, and the like, often accompanied by the use of violence. But the definition of organized crime in UNTOC can also cover cases of so-called white-collar or state corporate crime, and in particular, certain forms of transnational organized corruption, where the main illicit activity is corruption itself. From the anti-corruption perspective, UNTOC contributes a valuable emphasis on cross-border networked crime or network corruption that is missing from the UNCAC. And it's therefore of considerable interest for contemporary anti-corruption work, both with the enforcement tools that this may provide, and also to introduce a greater and more appropriate amount of stigma to certain white-collar criminal activities. The UN Secretariat's August 2020 UN Common Position to address global corruption pinpoints why this is of interest. It notes that during the past decade, the world has been plagued by a series of complex multi-jurisdictional corruption scandals perpetrated by organized networks involving the public and private sectors, networks that often operate simultaneously in the legal and illicit spheres, as well as the formal and informal sectors, with some traced to the highest levels of government. An example is the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia, where a prominent bank played a significant role, but there are countless other examples. So what kind of coordination might help? We've noted that there are overlaps in the subject matter and, unsurprisingly, in the two conventions. Not only do both conventions have provisions on the criminalization and prevention of corruption, but as Ugi mentioned, they have similar provisions in other areas like liability of legal persons, criminalization of money laundering, confiscation, international cooperation, and so on. And this means that coordination and communication is warranted for efficiency and effectiveness, whether at national level or in international processes and discussions about implementation. Now, naturally, there are also benefits to specialization and separate processes, but the interlinkages should be reflected in whatever arrangements are made. And I'd like to look at a couple of examples briefly. Now, coordination between the review mechanisms could offer benefits. And indeed, there is already a certain element of cooperation. So the UNTOC review questionnaire says that the review of Articles 8 and 9 of the UNTOC is only for those state parties that are not parties to the UNCAC. Now, it seems that the monitoring of those articles has effectively been delegated to the UNCAC review mechanism. And while this has a welcome logic, on the other hand, in the context of the big delays in the second cycle of the UNCAC review process, it would have been beneficial to have a follow-up review of criminalization of corruption. The first UNCAC review reports on criminalization were completed over 10 years ago, and there has been no formal follow-up process. Nevertheless, the UNTOC approach shows the possibility of coordination. And of course, it shows that as well in the sense that a state party may refer to responses and documentation that it has submitted under the UNCAC review mechanism with respect to obligations that are identical or similar to those under the UNTOC, with the caveat that those should be updated. At some stage in the future, it could be considered whether there could be joint reviews of some of the articles of the two conventions, if the differences in timetables can be overcome. Now, looking at the working groups of the respective conventions, perhaps there could be more coordination there too. The UNTOC has a working group on international cooperation, for example. The UNCAC holds expert meetings on international cooperation once a year. Could it make sense to combine meetings of the two conventions on the subject of international cooperation? Aren't there many shared issues that could be discussed in common? I believe there was a state party proposal to that effect 5 or 10 years ago, but it did not receive sufficient support at the time. Maybe this could be something looked at now. With regard to UNCAC working groups on prevention and asset recovery, presumably there would be a benefit from exchanges in those bodies with those participating in UNTOC and bringing to those working groups some of the discussions that are taking place in UNTOC. By way of one small example, when it comes to transparency of corporate structures, it would make sense for states to take into account relevant language in both conventions. And this could be a subject of discussion in the working groups. More generally, some of the experience in preventing and punishing organized criminal activity is likely to be of interest to anti-corruption specialists and vice versa, and could be shared in respective working groups. But beyond such exchanges, we have argued that it would be desirable to set up a coordination body to support work on common issues under the two conventions. Such a body could look at common methods and instrumentalities used in transnational organized crime and corruption. And one of the most interesting potential focus areas for such a body would be on schemes that have elements of both corruption and transnational organized crime. More specifically, it would be very useful for the two conferences to get together to discuss how to better address grand corruption and state capture, which both contain elements of corruption, transnational corruption and transnational organized crime in general. So I leave you with those thoughts and suggestions, and I look forward to our further discussion of the matter and to potentially bringing together discussions of within UNCAC and UNTOC in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. I think you provided us with a lot of very rich ideas for further discussion and elaboration. And now I give the floor to Ian Tennant, who is the head of multilateral representation of GI-TOC and also the director of the Resilience Fund of GI-TOC. Ian, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ugi, and thank you for your detailed updates and recommendations, Gillian. It's been a pleasure for GI-TOC and Transparency International to work together on this issue with EPLO, and now to get to more detailed recommendations, which is the point. I think we're at the point now where member states who are interested are asking us to provide a bit more details and ideas. So hopefully these get taken forward. So I have a few slides. So if I can go to the next slide, please. So Gillian mentioned the idea of transnational organized corruption, and I believe you mentioned this in your opening remarks as well, Ugi. Back in 2021, the Global Initiative published a report on a more coordinated response to multilateral response to organized crime and corruption. And in this, one of the kind of key messages that came out of it through our conversations with experts was that it's very difficult to disentangle organized crime and corruption, and therefore it's very difficult to respond to those issues in a separated way. And we're very aware that both conventions do not attempt to define either organized crime or corruption, and that sometimes the many definitions can be confusing. But at the same time, we've come up with this concept of organized crime, organized corruption, which Ugi defined in various reports as the involvement and or use of an organized interest entity, criminal or not, in various forms of corruption. He says it's not only about systemic illicit financial gains and undue influence, but also about systemic buying and influencing of social support. And I think the point is not whether it's technically organized crime or technically corruption, but it's all part of the same behavior and culture, which allows both organized crime and corruption to thrive. So if we can move to the next slide, please. We can see how some of these concepts can be brought together with organized corruption as the kind of the heart or the center, the central components. So Gillian mentioned white collar and corporate crime. We've heard state capture being mentioned. So these are kind of two sides of the triangle. But the other side of the triangle, which we think at GI-TOC is very important, is what we call criminal governance. And this is where at the local level, the state is no longer able to control the territory, and criminal groups with the support of corrupt actors are able to control that territory. And if you're confused about the broken arrows that you can see on the screen, what these denote are all our different responses. So maybe one is some articles of UNTOC, one is some articles of UNCAC, one is the OECD Bribery Convention, FATF, whatever it may be, other local or regional responses. The point we're trying to make is that organized corruption is not being attacked in a cohesive way or in a strategic way by these instruments at the moment, because, as Ugi said, they don't talk to each other very much and not very coordinated. So we see more of a need for a more central response. So we can move to the next slide, please. This is a summary of the GI-TOC TI submission that was made to the UNCAC Conference of States Parties. We can put the link in the chat maybe later on. But basically, the four main pillars that we had were regular joint meetings of the cost for the working groups, the review mechanisms, maybe the use of the CCPCJ as a forum for some of these joint discussions, reporting back from these collaborative meetings to their respective COSPs, and crucially, and we'll come more to this later, enhance civil society access to both processes. As Gillian mentioned, the positive decision that's been made this week, we hope this could herald a new era, as we've seen many years of outside expertise being restricted in some of these discussions. Next slide, please. So one way, and just to build on what Gillian said, when these joint meetings are held between the UNTOC and the UNCAC working groups, between the review mechanisms, and between the conferences, we think a definite positive outcome will be more effective and efficient technical assistance. Both review mechanisms essentially have as an objective that technical assistance needs are identified. So if they are more coordinated, we can prevent the scenario where a country spends, so since 2009, more than 10 years on the UNCAC review mechanism, and now they start the UNTOC review mechanism now and have to go through the same process again in quite a separate way. So if there was more coordination, more targeted technical assistance for countries could be identified. The international organizations, so in this case, UNODC, but also regional organizations that work on these issues and civil society organizations would have more coordinated data to work on in order to inform their development responses. We think that as part of this, the participation and engagement of non-governmental actors would help with that coordination as an outside body, which could ensure that this coordination is followed up on. Next slide, please. But I think what's more important than the technical assistance is the form of engagement and exchange between different parties involved. And also, when you focus too much on technical assistance, you are talking about the problem as if it's just a problem for developing countries, when in fact, both organized crime and corruption, as we know, require an enhanced response from all states, and it's not developing states where organized crime and corruption are the only countries who have a problem to deal with. So how would we do that? And actually, we would go back to the conventions, in my opinion, and the twin articles that exist in UNTOC Article 28, in UNCAC Article 61, on the collection, exchange, and analysis of information on the nature of organized crime or on corruption. This article is almost identical in both conventions. Firstly, the three paragraphs. The first one, that the states parties should analyze in consultation with the scientific and academic communities. In UNCAC, it talks about experts more generally on the circumstances in which organized crime operates. Secondly, that they should consider sharing analytical expertise with each other through international regional organizations, and that states parties should consider monitoring its policies and actual measures, making assessments of their effectiveness and efficiency. Now, these articles sit separately to the review mechanism, and I would argue that the review mechanisms that have been negotiated are not completely in the spirit of this article. In fact, these articles aren't reviewed either. So my kind of general recommendation would be, when we're implementing some of these recommendations, including the ones that Gillian has outlined, that we keep this spirit in mind. And maybe it's time to open up these discussions, have more substantive debates with civil society, academia, private sector playing a key role in providing that data that governments don't have, and in holding governments to account in terms of implementation, and holding UNODC to account in terms of the technical assistance and other responses that are needed. So we can go to the next slide, please. This is, I mean, obviously a main objective of this is an impact on the criminal markets and the corruption that we're trying to deal with through these conventions. And part of the way this would be achieved would be through a higher visibility and impact across the UN. When the UN itself, across Geneva, New York, and all its different mandates, is already quite fragmented and siloed in many cases, looking at organized crime itself, which we've done, we've seen that out of the UN's 102 entities, bodies, or agencies, more than 3/4 have some kind of organized crime mandate. But at the same time, in Vienna, where we are, as Ugi described earlier, we have a very siloed approach between the two conventions, but also between the conventions and the two separate governing bodies that the UNODC has, where we don't really have joint meetings and we don't really have joint responses or a strategic approach across all of these agendas. So by the UNTOC and the UNCAC coming together and demonstrating the importance of the issues by acting in a more cohesive way, we think this could bring more attention and a stronger voice to these issues across the rest of the UN system, and therefore catalyze more strategic responses more generally as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, for a very, very interesting presentation and pointing out to, I think, strategic approach that should be taken in enhancing this coordination. As you said, it's not only technical assistance issue, much more than that. So I have a pleasure now to give a floor to Ana Paula Oliveira, analyst of GI-TOC, and she will give an example of possible cooperation focusing on witnesses and whistleblowers. Ana, Paola, it's your floor.
Thank you, Uki. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this side event today. Thank you for Ian and Gillian for the previous presentation. I'll be brief in my comments since I'm very aware of the constraints of time, and then we have to keep strict to the next side event. But yes, if you can come to the next slide, please, Claudio. First, I would like to highlight why this particular group is of concern and why we need to stress and join efforts to protect them. So witness and whistleblowers are targeted because they exposure criminal activity, in case corruption or other types of illicit markets. And they are also pivotal in contributing for public accountability in the rule of law. And precisely because of this role, we've been noticing an increasing trend of targeting witnesses and whistleblowers, including through surveillance, cyber attacks, strategic lawsuits against public participation, arbitrary arrests, death threats, and in extreme cases, murder. The Global Initiative has a program, Assassination Witness, which monitors the phenomenon of target killings around the world related to organized crime, and has been vocalizing that violence against those attempting to hold criminal and corrupt actors to account is part of a growing concern around the commercialization of violence. So according to our last round of the Global Assassination Monitor, 4% of the cases of assassination worldwide target people belonging to the criminal justice system, which includes not only magistrates, prosecutors, lawyers, but also whistleblowers and witnesses, including witnesses assigned to protection programs. In most cases, witness and whistleblowers, what we note is that they are targeted because they are part of this, what Ian and Ugi had mentioned, organized corruption. So an environment that is conducive to violence against these people. So coming back just to summarize this, first point, why corruption and organized crime combine to create the environment that put people at risk. And then the second level, we also think that organized crime can be used as a tool to corrupt actors to put people in danger. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So the international level, what the UNTOC and the UNCAC says. So in Article 24 at the UNTOC, there is a specific provision on protection of witness. In the UNCAC, Article 32 and Article 33 both have protection of witness, and then Article 33, the protection of reporting persons. They are very similar in language. So both set standards, so states should, within its means, provide effective protection to those who report or contribute to criminal cases, as well as to those who are close to them. So not only to the witness and the whistleblowers, but also their relatives, their families. And as I mentioned, there is a concern that these provisions are falling short in practice due to the lack of implementation. So bringing a little bit of the combination of the different sides of the UN, and earlier this year, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights has noted how the safeguards to protect whistleblowers are often weak or inexistent. So that's why we feel that it's very important to have a joint conversation around these provisions between the two bodies, UNTOC and UNCAC. And briefly, so what is the way moving forward? Next slide, please. We believe that this trend demands a comprehensive and integrated response between these two bodies. The UNTOC review mechanism is an opportunity for having this conversation. Obviously, as also Ugi mentioned, in terms of time, perhaps is not ideal, since Article 24 is only expected to be reviewed not earlier than 2026, I believe. But until there, we can take some lessons learned from the review mechanisms at the UNCAC, since Article 32 and 33 were part of the first cycle of the review. Even last December at the COP, states parties adopted a resolution 9/4, which requests UNODC to provide member states with assistance in incorporating appropriate measures to provide protection to those reporting on corruption. So I think that says that because most of the recommendations that state parties received was to strengthen their protection mechanisms. So this is a way, an avenue that maybe some lessons can be learned. And on the flip side, the organized crime angle brought by the UNTOC can also benefit perhaps a further review of these provisions or joint meetings or other types of dialogue. In terms of assessment, the incorporation of the provisions in the national law, I think is just the first step. A legal protection is rarely sufficient, so it's not only necessary to pass laws, but improve the legislation and also policy. So there is so they are tailored to facilitate communication and information sharing. Other areas of focus could be the creation and strengthening of reporting and protecting mechanisms. As I mentioned before, they sometimes not even exist. Witness programs with a focus on preservation of identity, as well as reallocation and training of the witness. Also, more research is needed, and for that, dialogue with civil society is paramount. The civil societies working on corruption have done work on this already. Many civil societies have also focusing on the witness side. So having dialogue, including those voices, is extremely important to promote an environment that is conducive for information sharing, because that's the ultimate aim. And when we are talking about cases of corruption and organized crime. And if I can finish with a remark, I think we have to all think about creating a system capable of protecting them. Otherwise, it's unlikely that witness and whistleblowers will be able to navigate and provide the information that is needed for accountability without facing severe risks. They and then in the long run, this may allow criminal and corrupt acts to go unreported, contributing to more levels of impunity and other failures in the criminal justice system. Thank you, Ugi. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Paula. I think this was one of the good examples that we need to elaborate more on how it is possible to improve these bringing together of the two conventions to improve, obviously, the efficiency in controlling and preventing organized crime and corruption. So we still have some time, not much, for any comments or questions that you may wish to pose to us, or just to make a comment on the subject matter that we have discussed here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. This is Antonino Tedesco from the Italian mission here in Vienna. And apologies for being late, but I assure you I was following online before entering the room. It's a busy week for us. And thank you very much for organizing this event. A very quick comment on what member states have done so far and what we are planning to do in the future. Just because 2021 has been a very important year for working on the links between corruption and organized crime. Italy, in particular, chairing the G20 group, made possible the adoption of a high-level principle on fighting against corruption and organized crime. And starting from that, we also introduced during the last COP UNCAC in the Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration, in the resolution of the Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration, and an operative paragraph asking UNODC to collect information from member states about the way member states fight against these links. So this is the first step, and the building blocks we will be looking into it for the next COSP. Italy already announced that our intention is to table a resolution at the next COSP UNCAC, exactly on this issue, on how to fight against these links, and all these suggestions were very important for us. We are looking forward to working together with GI-TOC, Transparency International, and all civil society organizations to drafting this resolution and going forward with our agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is a very worthy initiative, and I submit that you should make the same resolution, exactly the same to COSP and COP. That's the way to make them work together.
We have to start. We have to start from somewhere.
So, sure. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you very much. This is Anna Alvazzi del Frate, the chair of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. I wanted to react to Gillian's proposal to join the working groups on international cooperation. That may take some time, but at civil society level, we may start having a sort of super constructive dialogue on international cooperation, inviting both the observers to UNTOC and UNCAC, and that I think is feasible next year. I don't think we need much more, and member states could already have some good examples of this type of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would just like to say that following this concern and also what Ian talked about, Article 28 and 61 and involvement of academic community, global initiative EPLO with participation of TI, IACA, UNODC is organizing at the end of this week in Athens a scientific colloquium on teaching organized crime and corruption courses in Southeast Europe. And the idea is that academic community pursues this idea of putting them together. And I think that is one of the ways in which we can implement part of the suggestions that were here made both by Gillian and Ian in their presentation. Yes, any other?
Yeah, no, I just want to very quickly say that Anna's exactly right. And, I think one of the lessons we can probably learn from the last couple of years is that we don't have to wait for the multilateral system to tell us when we can meet with each other. Civil society can take a leadership role itself.
Okay, Gillian, we don't have much time, but Gillian, there is a question for you. Okay, and it says that you mentioned that at some point the state party, the both UNTOC and UNCAC, proposed closer collaboration and it was not supported. Do you know what were some of the reasons behind the lack of support?
I'm afraid I don't. That's a good question. I'm afraid I don't know, and I believe that it was not understood well at the time, but it had to do with some kind of political consideration rather than the potential effectiveness of joining the discussions.
Thank you very much. But we are now, we have a good perspective with the Italian initiative, which is along these lines, and I think that should be supported, and civil society should also support it fully. I think we are closing, so I would like to thank, first of all of you that have come and participated in this side event, all those online that have followed us, and then in particular, I would like to thank Gillian, Anna, and Ian for their presentation. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.